All right, hello everybody, welcome. Two small announcements. Hi, Lucas. Two small announcements before I start introducing Professor Bozşahin. First of all, please leave your questions to the Q&A session. We will not accept any questions during the presentation. And the second one is we are recording this talk for your information. All right, so Professor Cem Bozşahin is a full professor of cognitive science at the Informatics Institute of Middle East Technical University. He's one of the founders of cognitive science program at METÜ, which is the very first cognitive science program in Turkey. Therefore, it's a very significant contribution to the foundations and developments in the field of cognitive science in Turkey. Professor Bozşahin works at the intersection of computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and cognitive science. In particular, he's studying the mechanics of projection of arguments and functions to surface structures in these domains. He received his PhD in computer science from Arizona State University. Before joining METÜ at 1992, he worked at Ohio University as assistant professor. Since then, he has done research at the University of Edinburgh, University of Lisbon, and briefly visited Boğaziçi University Cognitive Science program in 2011. Today, Professor Bozşahin is with us to share his research titled Idiosyncrasy in Grammar. Welcome, Cem Hocam. And so you have your screen with us. And the screen is yours now.
All right. I hope everyone can hear me. Rabia, thank you for the introduction. Thanks everyone for coming. I meant to be at Istanbul for this, but you know, this is not going to happen. So I'll try to do my best to pretend that I'm there and to present the whole thing. So I'm going to talk about idiosyncrasy in grammar, and this is something that we've been working on since 2017. I essentially stumbled into this, working on multi-word expressions. So this is a joint work with the people that you see on the screen. The Turkish names in this group are Özkan, Burcu, Arzu, and Umut constitute the Turkish multi-word expressions group. We used to meet regularly, and we continue to do that after the Corona lockdown. Let's see if I can get full screen on this. Can you? Okay. So just to give you a summary of what I'm about to say, when you look at idiosyncrasies in grammar, at least certain kinds of idiosyncrasies, especially in particular idioms and multi-word expressions, they seem to reveal some degrees of freedom from the data, and you would expect that to be arising from the theory of grammar itself, rather than just a random coincidence in your data. And I'm going to argue that that's because, unlike other idiosyncrasies, they have internal structure. So I'll try to talk about what kind of internal structure they have. So I'll start with Bollinger, Dwight Bollinger, one of the, I think, greatest semanticists of the 20th century. In his 1971 book, the Phrasal Verb in English, he said the phrasal verb is a floodgate or metaphor. And of course, the natural question to ask when you read this is, well, floodgate for what? Well, he had in mind word formation in English. He said, because of these, the phrasal verb, I looked the word up, I picked the book up, he built up the fire and things like this. Because of these, and because of its connections to other processes in English, the English lexicon is not flooded by neologisms, and it's essentially doing the work of floodgate. Well, the next step from that is from the lexicon, of course, is to move up to grammar, and in the way Bollinger talks about the grammar lexicon relation. So I'm going to try and do that myself and see whether we're trying to get close to what Bollinger had in mind. So the idiosyncrasies that we see in language are, idioms, collocations, metaphors, allegories, and named entities. They come in different varieties. So I'm going to try and distinguish some of these, for instance, metaphors and collocations from idioms, to give you a motivation for zooming in these idioms for internal structure and not doing too much about the others like metaphors in the grammar. One very influential study on idioms goes back to 1994 by Nunberg and company. They talked about three kinds of idioms. The first, A and B, shows what Bollinger called the phrasal verb. I picked the book up versus I picked up the book. In their terminology, in the terminology of Nunberg and colleagues, this is called a verb particle construction. The third one, C, 1C, is sort of spill the beans, in other words, reveal a secret that divulge some information. This is called the idiomatic combining phrase. So it's idiomatic in the way it combines, and so you can say you're spilling the beans. But you can also say the beans that you spilled cause no harm and things like this. So these are syntactically freer, but still require special attention to what is being predicated. And then you get the third kind, the phrasal idiom, which is 1D. So when you say the old man kicked the bucket, and these are more frozen in the sense that you don't get too much of syntactic freedom in these expressions. You can say the old man kicked the proverbial bucket, but there are only certain modifiers that kicking the bucket can take, and you can't say the bucket that you kicked to mean the idiom, or you can't say the old man kicked the bucket that I bought yesterday. So that's just not the idiom. So in terms of semantics, when you there is a difference. Of course, C and D are of course different than their interpretations, but 1A and 1B is also they're also quite different. So when you say I picked, if you try and answer the question, what did you do? And the answer is, I picked the book up. So you're not really answering the question. The question asks for an achievement, and you say, I picked the book up, which is considered what's called in event semantics, this is called a culminating event. It's not an achievement, but a culminating event. So if in response to what did you do, you say, I picked the book up, it's in some sense incomplete, and you would expect a continuation, like I picked the book up and swatted the fly or something. But if the answer is 1B, what did you do? I picked up the book. Your answer, I'm asking for an achievement, and you're giving me an achievement because picking up is an achievement. So there is no expectation of continuation in that sense. So I'm saying this because in the literature, you see that I picked the book up and I picked up the book are considered variation of the same thing, but they don't mean the same thing, and that's what we're trying to get at. And I think that's what Nunberg was trying to get at, and company was trying to get at when they call them verb particle construction rather than just a simple alternation. So the common property they have in terms of these three classes of idioms is not all of the elements. Can you see my cursor, by the way? Okay. So not all of the elements sort of contribute to the argument structure of the surface expression. They are the arguments of an predicate implicated in the expression. So when you say spill the beans, you mean divulge, but you're not. The divulge is not in the expression, and you're not divulging the beans. Of course, you're divulging a secret. So these are not in the expression, but these are implicated by the surface verb that you have. And of course, the implication, the interpretation is idiosyncratic in some sense. So one definition from Zag and colleagues is they are idiosyncratic interpretations that cross word boundaries. So in that sense, they are semantically idiosyncratic, obviously syntactically more restricted than free phrases. And they also cross word boundaries. So that's the connection to multi-word expressions. And when you look at idioms compared to other idiosyncrasies, like if you take a metaphor, metaphors are essentially sense extensions from the surface expression. When you say you shine in that exam, there is some kind of shining going on here. It's just that you're extending the sense of shine. You're not predicating another predicate. You're just extending the sense of shining. And usually when you do that, the modifiers that follow the sense extension are similarly extended. So you can say, well, you shine in the exam. It was a brilliant performance. Now, brilliance sort of extends shine, and performance is related to exam. So this is what you get with metaphors. The sense extension seems to sort of spread over the arguments in the surface expression rather than implicating something that's not there. And one, I think the most important distinction of metaphors from this is you don't expect to see a historical precedence behind a metaphor, whereas idioms usually are expected to have some traditional, conventional, historical reference to something, like spilling the beans or maybe like kicking the bucket is some kind of tradition. Or like shoot the breeze and things like this. So this sort of refers to some kind of practice before extended to current use. So in that sense, idioms really do not extend the sense of a predicate like a metaphor. They implicate another predicate. And that's the sort of first cue as to how we can sort of tie in these idioms into grammar, where there'll be not only a syntactic category for it, there'll be a logical form which can principally refer to some other predicate because it's there from the lexical correspondence. Now, idioms have very interesting properties compared to metaphors as well. So you could say, I twiddled my thumbs. And that's an interesting idiom in the sense that usually idioms are not considered to contain the subject, but here it does. So you can say, I twiddled my thumbs, but it's a bit funny to say, I twiddled your thumbs. So this is sometimes called the semantic reflexive. And even if you do that, when you say you twiddled my thumbs, yes, you're sort of referring to it, to the idiom, but you're doing it in an allegorical way. And here is, I found something on the web, the number 3. So gentleman is apparently in trouble, and he says, yes, Your Honor, these are the thumbs I twiddled for 31 days. So this is essentially an allegory over an idiom. It's not just, he's trying to be careful but still wants to get the message across. So essentially, if you make a distinction between idioms and allegories, idioms versus free literal interpretations versus metaphors, then you're going to make the task of others, like post-processes after this grammatical process of derivation, deriving an expression, easier. Because I can read this allegory over an idiom if someone takes care of the idiom in the first place in grammar. And relating to, of course, since we're in Turkey, I can't get away without talking about morphology. So, so when you look at some Turkish idioms, this is you know, toz kondurmamak is to protect B and reason. I did not gloss B and C. I'm sorry about this because these idioms are difficult to gloss anyway. This is the idiom. And you can see the idiomatic uses like unless toz kondurmaz. I mean, she defends her mother, yeah, no matter what, or he or she. And this is an idiom that necessarily contains the negative. So if you take out the negative morphologically, unless toz kondurtu, this is no longer just the idiom. It is an allegory over an idiom. At least to me, in my Turkish, this is an allegory. And it's difficult to interpret. And the first time I said this, I was like, well, where is the idiomatic reading? I needed to get a post-interpretation to see it as deriving from an idiom. So that happens in English as well. So these are examples in number 5 are sort of challenges to compositionality of the phrases. Usually a phrase is considered compositional because the meaning of the phrase is composed of meaning of the components plus the way you combine the components. That's the Fregean principle of compositionality. And this is what is at stake in interpreting an idiom. They are not truly compositional in that sense. So when the idiom is implicated, but the verb that heads the idiom is not there, this is a pretty quite difficult challenge for understanding the idiom. So I asked 5 around. I asked people, and most of them said, "Yeah, we get the idiom, but it's not in my idiolect." So not all the speakers obtain an idiom reading for this, although they know the implicated idiom. So that's a bit of a difference. So in A, when you say, when I face the proverbial bucket, the verb kick is not there. Similarly, tip over the beans for bean, and this is an historical, C is a historical reference, but the idioms, the predicate that introduces the idiom is not there. That's quite a challenge. But I think it just shows that when you do this, and when not everybody gets the reading, this is probably not a lot to do with grammar. Maybe this is something else. Over and above grammar, perhaps. And other kinds of idiosyncrasies, when you look at like collocations and named entities, they don't really have a lot of internal structure. In fact, not at all, none at all. So like you can have by and large, but you can say large and by, and you can say every which way, which is, I don't know whether it's an idiom or some kind of collocation. And you can say, well, you know, my team, they scored every which way. We scored a header, we scored, you know, left foot, right foot, everything, self goals. But you can say some which way. So they don't have they don't really have a lot of structure. And E and F are essentially, the secret policeman's ball sketch is a proper name for a TV sketch. And if you're going to refer to that sketch, you have to have the thing in full. You can't say the secret policeman's ball announcement to mean that sketch. So you have to say the secret policeman's ball sketch enhancement or something like that. These are essentially frozen expressions, and they're more like collocations rather than frozen idioms. And similarly for G and H, there is just a whole lot of structure. And I compare this with number 7, which is an idiom. You can say, well, we shot the breeze, or you can also say we were just standing around shooting the breeze. So shoot now in this one is getting inflection, and this is going to be, and this means there is a bit of structure that you're tapping into, so that you can change the interpretation because of these internal structures. And similarly here, in green example, he had not been on the verge of spilling the beans. So that's essentially not spill the beans as a frozen expression, but it's inflected and it's got a structure that is different than just infinitive spill. Of course, there's a limit to that structure, as you can see in 7c. I'll come back to that later, but there is some structure. And when you look at proverbs, well, they don't seem to have a lot of structure either. So here's one from Turkish, which happens to have a perfect correlate in English. Yerin kulağı var. When you say that, was that ears? When you inflect the ear in Turkish, this is like kulak. When you pluralize it, it's going to take some time for people to understand you're talking about the idiom. So this is like a post-processing rather than just, yep, I know what you're talking about. So in short, there seems to be something about idioms that you would want to tackle in grammar because it has to do with structure. So in that regard, some empirical experiments have been done, and one I'm going to talk about today, and which is what we've been discussing in our group, is a measure of compositionality. And Gong and company talk about geometry of compositionality. This is a machine learning experiment where they tested compositional phrases and non-compositional phrases like multi-word idioms, collocations, others, by using principal component analysis. Principal component analysis is a dimension reduction technique to understand the underlying structure of a surface expression. The way they did this is a work on computational linguistics. So they took word vectors. Word vectors are things that we build over large volumes of data, over Google and all the rest of it. And you build fixed length vectors like a vector of like a word and its 200 neighbors and things like this. And you take these vectors, essentially gives you as a distributional sort of idea about how the words go along with other words. They compared the vectors of these expressions, one compositional, one literal, and if a word or a multiple expression and its context are geometrically related as jointly lying in a linear subspace, they lie in a linear subspace when the expression appears in a compositional sense, but not in a non-compositional sense. So here's some result. What's a linear subspace? A linear subspace is a well-contained, convexly contained subspace of another space. So here, the green dots. This is an example from their paper. So this is the geometry of cutting edge collocation. So the compositional interpretation is like cutting edge of a knife and things like that. And the non-literal interpretation is like this is cutting edge research. So you're doing all these brilliant experiments. So the green ones are the compositional ones, cutting edge, literally interpreted. And the red ones are the non-compositional cutting edge, like cutting edge research, whatever. These are contextual, that is, these are cutting edge situated in words that appear around them. And the blue point is the embedding of the phrase cutting edge itself. So when you look at this blue line, blue point, it lies in the same linear subspace of the green lines, but the red lines are not in the same linear subspace of the blue line. So the phrase, so this is a distributional way of testing, for instance, compositionality versus non-compositionality. And that was a very so striking result. So we've been discussing this for almost 2 months now, and we're doing some experiments on this. So the kind of data they work with well, this is the sentence. Like, so you take two pairs of sentences. One has a compositional use, the other one has non-compositional use. So the example with yellow has a compositional use, and the example with green has non-compositional use of blue sky. And when you look at this from the perspective of that kind of geometric linear subspace, their compositionality scores are very different. So they are capturing something in a very distributional way because of the fact that in computational linguistics, we can build very powerful, very sort of reliable word vectors for neighborhood of words, word use. So we're using that for something else in our group. We're going to use that this way as well. But first, we're trying to see whether this geometry of compositionality can distinguish literal, can tell us about something about literal and metaphoric use. So we're assuming that because metaphors extend sense of the current surface predicate, and that extension seems to spill over to the modifiers of the surface predicate, they're going to stay compositional, whereas idioms will not stay compositional. So we're checking this out, and we've been doing experiments, and the early results seem to show that, well, yeah, metaphors do not stray too far from a compositional use, but idioms do for Turkish. So this is the kind of Turkish example we're running using the same method. This is essentially talking nonsense in idiom in Turkish. I did not gloss it because I don't know. This is essentially Tarzan Turkish, and this is one of the perils of doing large-scale data-oriented work in computational linguistics. These word vectors tend to get very sparse when the word is inflected. So if there are too many inflected words in the word vector, because the frequency of the inflected word is usually less and less because it gets longer and longer, it's more difficult to build the word vector. So they sort of cut out the inflections, and they give you, you try compositionality with examples like this, and at the end you get some Tarzan Turkish, but you get the idea. When we try this is like, the man is making up stories, and he's just, making no sense, completely nonsense, and people are laughing at him. And the compositional one says, well, the butcher cuts the lamb and then beef, and then he throws away tripe, which is the same expression in Turkish, and then he makes soup, and then, so this is the compositional use of tripe and throw, whereas this one is idiomatic use. And in the first experiment, although we're not sure this is the sort of final word on this, but their compositionality scores seem to be quite different as far as we can tell. So we're still continuing on this. But I'm just trying to show you this because there is a way to put compositionality to sort of empirical test, so that is distinguish idioms versus literals and metaphors in one place. So idioms are quite non-compositional in another sense than the metaphor. That's what we're trying to find out. Again, just to sum up, there seems to be something about idioms that you wouldn't want to leave out in a grammar, because they have internal structure, and you want to capture that structure in a grammar. So that takes us to Bollinger again. He said, it's if you're going to talk about meaning, and if you're going to talk about meaning of predicates that are not in the suffix expression, then, well, practically speaking, there is no such thing as an identical synonym. So there's no notion of synonymity, and that sort of harks back at like Hintika and others who provided some criteria for synonymy. And number two is this is from the intonation book. It's about, you know, there's no such thing as a meaningless word. Even those function words have a meaning. It's just that it doesn't seem to be a very contentful meaning, so to speak. So we'll see what these two ideas can bring to understanding the semantic contribution of an idiom. So I'm going to try and do all this in a grammar formalism, and there's one called combinatory categorical grammar of Mark Steven, which has been worked out over the last 40 years, and it's known to bring 5 things into one computational system. Essentially, Bollinger's idea of taking semantics seriously all the way across, not just for content words. Frege's principle of compositionality that I mentioned earlier. Zelig-Harris's notion of transparency of syntax, semantics, phonology relation, which goes back to 1946. Is a bit of anecdote. Arvind Joshi told me that when he arrived at Penn in 1957, Noam Chomsky was making corrections to his master's thesis. They both worked with Zelig-Harris, and they would wait at the door of Zelig-Harris to enter and make the for a research meeting. And he said, every time I showed Zelig a constraint on language, he just said, no, language is a free algebra. Language is a free algebra. And I think what he was trying to get at is Harris's notion of transparency. But by free algebra in mathematical terms, he's saying this relation must be transparent. Well, since idioms aren't so transparent, how do you put these two together is the critical question. And I'm going to talk about Bauer's rule-to-rule thesis, which goes back to 1976, and Stevens' projection principle. When you put all of these 5 things together, you essentially get syntax, semantics, phonology as you in a lockstep as you drive a surface expression. And so I wrote a book about trying to understand all these people, how all this work together, and it was published in 2012. And the book is about essentially combinatorial grammar and how it came to be the linguistic theory that it is now. It's sort of mathematical foundations of it, computational foundations of it, and linguistic aspects, linguistic foundations of the whole idea. And essentially, it's my attempt to understand these 5 people. The idea of deriving a surface expression in categorical grammar is called type transparent derivation. This is not the way Zelig-Harris formulated it, but this is the way we interpret it in CCG. So the phonological, syntactic, and logical forms are defined over exactly the same notion of derivation constituency. So the computational system is doing the derivation, is delivering you the constituents, and from these steps of the computation, you do your phonology, syntax, and semantics in lockstep, rather than having three different systems doing their own thing and trying to meet up. So in that sense, when you have one system doing all this, the interfaces between phonology and syntax and semantics are trivial in some sense, because it's all in lockstep. So they're always aligned. In fact, although they have their own, phonological rules are of course different than syntactic rules, and semantic rules are different than phonological rules. They apply in parallel. But in the end, since this is all driven by the same derivational process, there is no need for independent computation. So it's just one take. So how is that put together is the story of CCG. And I'm going to talk about the implications of that for the idioms and idiosyncrasy in grammar. and the idea is, well, when you look at idiosyncrasy from that perspective, most of the idiosyncrasies turn out to be just degrees of freedom that we haven't looked before in grammar. So Boss' rule-to-rule thesis from 1976 mentions syntactic rules and semantic rules, and this is the way he phrased it. I'll just let you read it. So he talks about representations, he talks about syntactic representations, and he talks about semantic representations. And the critical point is that neither type of rule has access to the other kinds of representation. The syntactic rule does syntax, semantic rule does syntax, but the semantic rule does its work only when the syntactic step is taken. And here's a bit of a side note from computer science. We've been doing this since 1960. This is how we write compilers in computer science, having syntactic rules for programming languages to translate them into executable code. And these rules don't talk to each other. They only talk at the interface of syntactic rule applying during parsing to get the executable translation code for using semantic rules. We just didn't know that it was a discovery procedure. So the syntactic rule that he's referring to in a lexical grammar like CCG is going to correspond to a combinator type. I'm going to explain the terms in green. So the syntactic rule becomes a combinator type, and in a lexical correspondence, I'll also explain that. And the translation rule that he talks about here is a lexically specified logical form. And according to CCG, as a linguistic theory, not just a formalism, but a theory with an empirical claim, all linguistic variation arises from fixing these 2 degrees of freedom. In other words, not one kind of rule, not being able to see what other kind of rule is doing. When you fix these 2 degrees in a lexical correspondence, we are suggesting that this is all you need to understand variation in languages. So that gives you it's a narrow sort of hypothesis space about what can be a lexical correspondence. So here, transparency means that there are no records to keep or derivation, the trees to build. And the way you do that is instead of using phrase markers, we're going to use surface type substitution rather than lexical insertion, because there's nothing to insert into if you're not keeping records of anything. And the rule-to-rule hypothesis means just apply the semantic rule when you apply the syntactic rule. So when you look at the problem, the interface, the Zillick-Harris interface, syntax, semantics, phonology, from this perspective, phonology becomes essentially segmental combination as you do the derivation. But of course, there's more to phonology than segmental combination. The way this is done is by interaction of the things that I mentioned above, for an interaction with the metrical grid and with phonological conditions of phrases and like edge properties and things like this. And morphology is not a module in itself or a separate process. It just distributes itself over a grammar depending on these interactions above. So this is a bit different than distributed morphology, where distribution is by design. We're saying, well, that's no, distribution is probably pretty much determined by the kinds of rules that you have for morphology. It could be relational, it could be inner rules, it can be segmental combination like in Turkish affixes. It could be templatic morphology like Hebrew, Arabic. And the reason why this is all forced into one way of computing is because in CCG, a grammar consists only of lexical correspondences. And that's why you're sort of forced to distribute morphology. In fact, morphology distributes itself, so to speak, in this theory. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by that. So I start explaining a bit of what's a lexical correspondence in CCG. So the thing on the left is called the phonological form. This is the explanation of the terms. The thing in yellow, I think it's yellow. Yeah, it's yellow. This is called the syntactic type. And it basically says, I require a noun phrase to the right to give you this. And this says, I need a noun phrase to the left, which happens to be third person singular, to give you a clause. And this clause is going to be finite. This is the sort of derivational recipe of CCG. And this is put in a correspondence with the predicate-argument structure in red. This is the logical form, so to speak. And the correspondence is done by the things in green, which is essentially the lambda calculus put to work as a sort of glue language between the syntactic type and the logical form or the semantics. Basically, X corresponds to the noun phrase, Y corresponds to third person singular noun phrase, because these are the order in which you abstracted over them. And this thing in red is actually a structured representation of meaning. So it's actually this red box at the bottom. So it sees X, Y. When you write papers, you're forced to write them linearly. So this is essentially bracketed like this. So it's left associative, but the intended structure is this. So this is the most prominent argument, and this is commanded by that most prominent argument in this notation. So this is how CCG is trying to put all these things. This is phonology, this is syntax, this is semantics, and this is the glue language, the sort of Bach's way of saying, when you do that, when you do the red stuff, the way you can do the red stuff is to get through the green stuff. And the way to get the green stuff is to run the yellow stuff, the syntactic category. So it's all driven by the syntactic type, the derivation process. When you apply this, you apply the substitutions indicated by the green correspondences, and that's going to give you some elements in the logical form. That's how you keep things in lockstep. So when you do, when you run your derivational process like this, then it's going to, how's morphology going to look? Well, it's going to be all over the place. So this is an example from Tagalog. In Tagalog, verbs are inflected for voice. If a verb is not inflected for voice, it cannot take place in syntax. So Billy, by, is not inflected for voice. For it to be available to syntax, you can put voice. So here is an infix, stuck in the first syllable. And that makes it an active, something in active voice. Active voice means the most prominent argument is an agent. So this is not segmental, but this is Tagalog's morphology, and infixation is very common in Tagalog, but it's not across the board. So some verbs like Billy do it, some verbs take another suffix like it's called mug. So there are different ways to form an active voice, but infixation is a very systematic way of doing it. And this is a relational rule. Look, there is one thing on the left and there is one thing on the right of the rule. So this is essentially not a combining rule. This is how we do sort of relational morphology in our sense of relational morphology. And you can see non-segmental stuff in English as well. So run and ran are obviously related. And if you try and derive ran from run in CCG, well, we don't do item and process kind of morphology. So these are forced to be lexical relations between run and ran. But of course, the lexical relation contains syntactic types and semantic types. So this is essentially, so that's why, well, that's not the only way English does past tense. So I worked is completely segmental, but this one is not. So this sort of is distributes itself. And the extent to which you can do this in languages is pretty striking. So this is a language, this is an example from a language of Alabama. where you take a verb, and if you want to add repetition aspect, you delete a syllable from the verb. Okay, so these two are related, but there is no such thing as a deletion operation in CCG. So this is forced to be a lexical rule in CCG, and that's how Alabama morphology is going to distribute itself over the grammar of the kind that you write in CCG. And this is from Arabic, where certain words are pronounced shorter when they are at the edge of a certain syntactic phrase. And the way you can handle these concerns, so you have to put phonology, syntax, semantics, all in tight correspondence to be able to do this. So you're going to have your syntax, you're going to have your semantics, and you're going to have these phonological constraints sitting over surface expressions to be able to model these morphosyntactic properties of classical Arabic. And this is ordinary, very sort of segmental combination in Turkish morphology. These suffixes combine very segmentally. There's of course more going on because evler is, when you pluralize evler, it's evler. But when you pluralize kitab, it's kitaplar. So there's a phonological thing going on. I did not put that much detail in it, but this is pretty much handled the way as we do it here. So my purpose of showing all this is trying to show you that all of these can be put in lockstep with each other, and that's going to give you some limited degrees of freedom to handle idioms as well. So this, in that sense, idioms will not be a whole lot different than what other aspects of other parts of grammar do. So how do we project these things in CCG? Well, I'm not going to go into details again, but essentially the syntactic, the derivational process is driven by these categories. So this says I'm a functor X looking for a Y. So Y, the yellow one is looking for a Y, and it says, well, I am Y, the green one, and I'm to your right, or like temporally after you. So when you were looking for a Y, I have a Y, I give you result X. And the way semantics is done in lockstep is, if this is the meaning of this functor, this is the meaning of that functor, the meaning of the result will be application of F to A. And if you compose rather than apply, something like this, this is X over Y with the meaning F, and it says, well, yes, I'm Y, but I need a Z to become Y. So this is going to be X over Z. But it's if you look at the semantics, this is a composition function. I'm composing F and G over a variable called X. This is application, this is composition. This is how you project. And when we present CCG rules like this, their relation to phonology is not so obvious, because after all, these are syntactic types and these are semantic types. But in their full form, what CCG is doing is actually something like this. I just take two rules to exemplify. If this is the phonological form of this function, this is the phonological form of that function. And if you combine these, you always get alpha beta. You just keep concatenating things. That's why there's a very limited degree of freedom. So how is all these people put together when you have a vocabulary like this, and what does it mean to the idioms? Well, you take an expression like this, and under the Steedman's projection principle basically says everything in the lexicon is projected without change. Well, he didn't put it that way, but that's pretty much what it amounts to. So when you look at this English expression, I persuaded John to study, but if you use promise or expect or want, the surface expressions, the surface structure are pretty much the same, but the meanings are entirely different. And you get this in lockstep communication by this. So this is the category of persuade. This is the meaning of persuade. Is first looking for a noun phrase. Well, here's a noun phrase in the same color. If you substitute for this MP, you're going to eliminate this. and you're left with this. So in CCG, we draw the lexical items on top, and we grow the tree towards the bottom, to the root. So this is the sequential step that you take in CCG. This is how you get your verb phrase, because to is an infinitival in this case. And this is looking for a VP, and here's your VP. You get this, and this is looking for an MP to the left, and here's the MP to the left. When you combine these things, you're going to get persuade. I persuaded John for John to study. So I am doing John is doing the studying. Now the promise and expect have exactly the same syntactic type, because the surface structure is the same. But the meaning is entirely different. Promise means when you say, I promised John to study, I'm doing the studying. When I said, I expected John to study, if you look at the predicate argument structure of expect, I am doing the expecting, John is doing the studying, and John is not an argument of expect, it's an argument of study. Here there is no X. Here there is X. And here, the inside predicate is controlled by the X, and in promise, the clause is controlled by Y, and that's how you get subject control, object control, exceptional case marking, and things like this in CCG. Always in lockstep, no traces, just everything as a surface type substitution. So once you do that, and I'm running short of time, I still haven't shown you any derivation of an idiom. Now, when you work with such a narrow formalism that forces you to distribute things, like what do you get for idioms? Well, only three kinds essentially. One, surface expression itself as a category. It's sort of a token as type idea. Or you can say, well, you have a surface expression, but you can carry head information, about the head of the phrase, and things like that. Or syntactically free category in Zilli-Harris's sense, but nothing else. This is all you get. So everything that you have in mind as a lexical correspondence has to be formulated in terms of these three properties in your grammar. This is your toolbox. And we're suggesting that all these idioms, verb particles, phrasal idioms, and idiomatically combining phrases are actually manifestations of 1 and 2. And compositionally, fully compositional phrases are essentially an instance of 3. So let me show you some of these. I'm not going without getting into detail. So to get back to pick the word up versus pick up the book. So pick will be something like this. This is pick the book up. I get the book first, and then I look for token as type. Instead of looking for the category of up, I'm looking for the token up to get my idiomatic phrasal verb interpretation. Because if I do this, I give you a special meaning of pick, essentially a culminating event. I am holding the book. This is different than achievement event in B. So when you say I picked up, if you take up first, I picked up the book. First you get up, and then you get the noun phrase, the book. And what you get is the achievement event, picking rather than holding. Okay, that's how we can begin to distinguish. But if you ask me a question, what did you do? I can give you different answers depending on the kind of semantics that which I think is going on in these examples. So you can make these distinctions lexically for idioms to be able to make meaningful inferences on meaningful question answering and things like this. So the things in yellow are called Singleton types. This is what we call them. And these things are not head features. These are what you can call morphophonological features. Again, just another indication of syntax phonology interface in CCG. They are information coming from the metrical grid. So minus heavy means it's not a heavy phrase, which you can measure from the size of the segment. So these are essentially all sort of part of the lexical correspondence. And this is how you drive. I picked the book up to give you the meaning that you're holding the book. I'm not going to show you internal details, but the critical point is shown in colors here. This is the pick the book up example. So it's looking for up rather than looking for the category of up, which is typical of CCG. Rather than looking for the red thing, it's looking for the token itself as a category to get the special meaning. And you get the special meaning at the bottom of the tree. So now, the good thing about this is that CCG's projection mechanism needs no amendment to be able to implement. It's been there from the beginning. We just haven't seen it before. We never understood that something like this would be needed. So this is already built into the system. There are some, by the way, Rabia, how much time do I have? Do you?
You have time, Hocam. Just finish as you like.
Okay, all right. So the thing about the verb particles is not all the particles are predicated, and that's an interesting aspect. And this is and you'd be worried about what to do about this in grammar. So this is an example from Levin and Sells. Wipe the window off. Off is not really predicating anything. I'm not a native speaker, so I'm just taking their word for it. That's a bit different than wipe the dirt off. When you wipe the dirt off, the dirt is off. But when you wipe the window off, the window is not off. So this is called an unpredicated particle, and you would want to distinguish that from the phrasal verb in the Bollinger sense. And this is one way to do it, but I am showing you this without the internal without the details, to point out that when you have this kind of semantic radar, but look, there is an unpredicated particle, but it's not a preposition, but it's a particle, but it's a particle, but it's not a predicated particle. All these distinctions that you haven't seen before begins to come out as some kind of obvious degrees of freedom that you haven't exploited before in the grammar. And coming back to the phrasal idiom, well, these are fixed expressions. So the bucket that you kicked, the relativized version of kicking the bucket, should not give you a sort of idiomatic rating. It will give you the phrasal rating, but not the phrasal rating is in B. You don't need the details. But the important thing is idiomatic reading is blocked in this case. The bucket that you kicked cannot give you the idiomatic reading of kicking. And this is because of the category of kick. And in this case, it's dying, but it's not dying in just in an ordinary sense. It's dying in a historical reference. It's a sort of traditional way, but it's also very euphemistic. So these we mark as event modalities. So they are subscripts of the predicate rather than the argument of the predicate. So this is an event modality of dying rather than the argument of dying, whereas Y is an argument of dying. I mean, when I say John kicked the bucket, John dies. But this is a euphemistic way of referring to his death. So this is, and when you capture this in the lexical correspondence, you can begin to answer very detailed, meaningful questions about what is meant by this, because you have these historical modalities there. And idiomatically combining phrases, well, they seem to be, again, revealing another degree of freedom. If you have a category like this, you can have the category carry the head word in it. And that seems to be exactly what idiomatically combining phrases need. So the beans that you spilled, in other words, if you relativize an idiom of the spill the beans kind, this is fine, unlike kicking the bucket. And the reason why it works is because this is a noun phrase. This is a larger distribution, larger type distribution as a noun phrase. This means a noun phrase headed by the word beings. This is a bit different than the fixed word up. So this has a wider distribution than the token, but not as wide as a free noun phrase like this one, which has no constraint on it, apart from being a noun phrase. And you can capture this using this, and it's going to give you divulging and a public modality. You're revealing a secret, but you're doing it in quite a public way. And the secret, this is just referring to some secret. So you're capturing a lot of things about, divulging a secret by saying divulge versus spilling the beans. Now that, finally, let me just talk about, there's this big Bollinger question. He said there is no such thing as a meaningless word. Well, when you put that to work in a grammar, well, that's something to worry about. So here's an example from Mandarin Chinese. So yo mo means humor in Mandarin Chinese, and the way you use this is an expression like 14a. And it's when you ask Chinese speakers, they say, well, yeah, yo mo, it's humor, and it means tease when you use it as a verb. But the way you use it is not really like a verb. Yeah, you can introduce tense markers. You can put in here huge expressions. Not only you can put proper names, you can say, I teased the man that I saw yesterday, things like this. So this could be pretty heavy. And then comes mo. And the funny thing is, neither yo nor mo means anything to Chinese. It's only when they're together, it means humor, but it cannot be used as a verb, as you can see in B and C. When you use them together, this is just not grammatical. Okay? So how do we capture this? I mean, if these two things are meaningless, how in the world do we get these things to mean IT's junction? Well, here's one way to do it. When you put yo, yi, and mo syntactically together, or in a controlled way of substituting for types, you're going to get a syntactic type for yo, but yo not by itself gives you tease. It is through yi and mo that gives you tease. So this is the category you're going to get your tease if you get a noun phrase, junction, and these two to give you IT's junction. Now the critical question for a grammatical theory is, well, what are these things? I'm using yi. I'm not using the category of yi. I'm using the yi as a token as a type. So why do I need a logical form and syntactic type for yi if I don't use it? Similarly for mo, if it doesn't mean anything, then where do I put it? Is it in the lexicon? Where is it? Well, according to CCG, they must be in the lexicon. And what they mean is really not all that important because they are given meaning by yo, by this lexical correspondence. So you have to have, for projection to work, you have to have something in the lexicon for yi and mo. This is what the theory says. But to get the meaning of tease, you have to combine them in the way yo requires it. So these are different questions. So in that sense, we agree with Bollinger that there is no such thing as meaningless word, because if you put these things in the grammar, there is no way projection system can work, according to us. This is not the answer that Bollinger had in mind, but this is the way we're interpreting him. So let me just stop here and give you sort of a synopsis of what we're trying to get at. It seems like there is very little you can do about metaphors. I would leave the metaphor to psychologists, essentially. These are just interpretations over a grammar to sense extensions and these. And there are some wonderful theories about metaphoric reasoning. And this can be, so the best you can do in a grammar is just deliver a logical form that is good enough for them to work with. But idioms appear to be a bit different. They have internal structure, so we can't really leave them out because we'll be throwing the baby out with the water if you do that. We're throwing away some structure that we're supposed to capture as a grammarian. And I think when you look at idioms, they seem to reveal quite a degree of strange degrees of freedom in the grammar that we haven't thought existed. So that's, I think, that was quite an eye-opener personally for me. And in some sense, you know, everything is idiosyncratic in the beginning anyway, although this is interpreted under some universal assumptions of syntax or conceptual structure. Everything you hear, the child hears, is essentially idiosyncratic. And so in some sense, you can say, well, you know, some idiosyncrasies may, so everything essentially is a token in the beginning, but tokens can move to types. Hume called that, you know, rising above experience. It's how do you rise above data? Well, you begin to form impressions, habits, and ideas and things like this. Well, this is the idea of turning token into a type. And some may still continue to be idiosyncratic, but for them to be idiosyncratic in the sense that they use it, they have to have some historical modality to distinguish them from like collocations and other stuff. And this widening of substitution is probably what you get in an adult grammar. So you take your, you know, all these idiomatic expressions, well, they tend to have the same distribution probability of being a noun, being a verb, being a verb phrase. Then you can move up to these. Of course, for this to work, there must be a limit to what you can move up to. So I mean, what is the possible category is a critical question for combinatory categorical grammar. And we're not assuming that anything goes. There is a limit to what you can categorize. But that's for another talk. So I'll stop here and thank you all.
Well, thank you, Cem. I'm going to applaud you on behalf of everybody.